You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the Teach Thought Podcast. Our mission is to rethink what's possible teaching and learning in a modern context. Join your classroom to the Teach Thought movement and be a part of the change.
Thanks for tuning in to the Teach Thought Podcast once again. I'm Drew Perkins, the Director of Professional Development here, and I encourage you to head on over to our professional development site. You can get there by teachthought.com/PD and check out our different services, our workshops, and how we can personalize PD for you. In today's podcast, I spoke with Larry Rosenstock, one of the co-founders and CEO of High Tech High, the famous High Tech High, and we had a great conversation around High Tech High and the genesis of it, the journey of it. We talked about how they hire and what they look for in teachers, as well as their grad school. Their graduate school of teaching, the pedagogical basis of their teaching and learning at High Tech High, how they approach accountability, and their role as a charter school. Enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Larry Rosenstock. Introduce yourself to the listeners. I don't think you probably need much of an introduction. You're sort of a rock star, and a lot of, and I don't even like that word. I don't know why I used it, but know, certainly well known as we think about education and High Tech High.
Well, thanks, Drew. This is Larry Rosenstock, and I am one of the founders and the CEO of the High Tech High Schools in San Diego area, California, and we now have 13 schools and a graduate school of education. And our motto is to work hard and have fun.
Work hard and have fun. Okay, so a lot of the folks probably are familiar with you from different places and sources. Most recently, perhaps from the documentary Most Likely to Succeed, which we did a podcast with Ted Dintersmith as well. But High Tech High seems to be sort of really flourishing as a model for a different way to do school. And it's I work with teachers around the country, and I hear all the time people say, "Oh, I went to visit High Tech High, and I went to visit High Tech High, and this is what I saw, and I loved it. And how can we sort of replicate sort of that thinking?" But what was the vision and mission behind getting it started and where you are now?
Sure. Well, I always make a lot of jokes about things like the vision, because people who have visions, they put in mental hospitals. You got to be kind of careful, and that we're not a model, because the definition of a model is a non-functioning replica, but we're an example of something. Okay, and the idea that was behind us had to do with sort of several things about what schools should be like. And those of us who started it, two of us in particular, Rob Reardon and I, both had worked together for decades and were at the oldest high school in the United States. So we had something to take away from that experience. We knew that we wanted to have schools that were committed to equity and that delivered upon it. We wanted to have schools that worked for all of the students who attended. We felt that we didn't want to have a school which was mispredicting based on socioeconomic status, race, gender, or standardized test scores which kids can and can't do various things. We knew that we wanted, in particular, students to be doing work that has value to them, and we wanted students to have voice and choice in their learning and have them be able to create new knowledge. And we wanted it to be a very rich learning environment for the adults who inhabit it. And we wanted it to be schools that intelligently allocate adult and student time, space, and resources. And those allocations, when I visit schools, are the way that you can really see the philosophy of the school being revealed. And we wanted the schools to be something that didn't just serve the public, but in a sense created a public. And that we wanted the walls to be as permeable as possible with the world outside of school, and not citadels apart from community. And we also felt, since we're charter schools, frankly, that innovation in the governance mechanism is an important, but in and of itself, insufficient condition. So people in all kinds of different regulatory and governance mechanisms should be able to do these things as well. And finally, that the schools are healthy and safe, that it is really, when you think of it, a sacred public trust to be responsible for people's children.
Mm-hmm. Well, that list of sort of guiding principles there is really ambitious. And when did High Tech High start?
2000, we opened on September 18th with our first small school called High Tech High, and that was a bumpy year, like any kind of startup, but we got through it. Mm-hmm. And not a bad year, just bumpy, because it's different when you're starting from nothing.
Sure.
And then we decided to add a middle school a couple of years later, and then we decided to add another high school because we were on this former 500-acre Navy base right near downtown in San Diego. So it was completely empty, and we had an opportunity to grab some buildings, and we continued to grab them all the way up to the present, where we just grabbed the last building out here, which is where SEAL Team 6 practiced, actually. And it has a gymnasium, and we have an elementary in it now that we've renovated it, and we have our graduate school of education in it. So we've been very fortunate in many, many kind of ways, but maybe it's like Louis Pasteur once said, chance favors a prepared mind. We have 3 villages of schools, one right on the border in Chula Vista, elementary, middle, and high. 7 schools right in Metro San Diego, elementary, middles, and highs. And then in San Marcos, up north a bit, driving distance, about 40 minutes, is an elementary, middle, and high. And then finally, we've got one more property that's right smack dab in the middle of those 3 that we purchased from the school district that we get in 2017 that will have elementary, middle, and high.
So you've got really sort of this, using the word model is maybe not the right word, but you've got an example that shows evidence of how you can do things differently and still be successful. And I think in most likely to succeed, you made some really great points in the excerpts that they showed, and they do focus on High Tech High quite a bit there, and some really amazing stories. But you mentioned charters, and so I'm curious what your take is on charter schools and charters, because clearly that's a real hot topic. I've seen some great ones. High Tech High is an example of a great one. But is this a good thing or a bad thing, or what's your take on that?
I don't feel like charters are necessarily a bad thing. I just don't feel that in and of themselves, as I said earlier, I don't think that they're an answer. I feel that for myself, I don't want to be known as a charter guy.
Right.
I want to be known as an education guy. And in particular, in my case, a public education guy. I mean, I feel about charters the same way I feel about private schools. I'm not opposed to private schools. I'm certainly not opposed to charters since I do them. I just think it's really about, for me, it's public education. And I think it's probably our most precious public institution in our society. And as the film, which I did not make, aptly, and I support, aptly points out, that the world is changing and schools are not. Mm-hmm. And if you look at, that's why I like the history part of the film as much. I mean, I know that history. It was not new to me, but I found that the filmmaker did an excellent job of laying that out for an audience. And when people realize, oh, that's where that came from. Wow, that was 124 years ago. We're a group of people in an entirely different world right now. Maybe we should really change that.
Right.
And that's what I like that the film reveals. And of course, I love Ken Jennings. Mm-hmm. and the points that he made, because it was precious what he had to say about his experience.
Yeah, it struck me. I'm not a big fan of Jeopardy. Ken Jennings, the guy from Jeopardy who won and beat the machine or beat the computer, but even he starts to really he recognizes and brings out that point that it's not about the answers anymore. He thought he had sort of figured it out, and now he's realized that he's easily replaceable in many senses as well. And I always look at some of these trivia game contests, things that you see teachers do, and I think why is it so important to know all those answers? And as you all think about I mean, so you've been around for 15, going on 16 years here, so it's not a new thing. I'm curious what those rocky, how you sort of overcame those obstacles to begin with, but then going forward, how do you keep that lens of quality? Because I think that's a really, as you
Right.
grow and scale, how do you keep that lens of quality or that quality? What's the lens that you use in the process?
Well, those are some terrific questions. First, I'll divide it into the obstacles and how to watch out for them, and then how you guarantee, secondly, this question of quality. In terms of the former, well, I think that it's important to recognize that it's a little bit bumpy when you start a new school, or like any entity that you're going to start, and that you need to have a sense of what your core values really are. And in our case, we knew that as important as pedagogy is to us, matters of equity rose above them. So that's why we use the zip code-based lottery, which is the only way that we accept kids. And that has to do with the law, which I know well, but, Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, separate but equal, Brown versus Board, together and equal. Neither one happened. And then we had a case fairly recently in which the Supremes allowed for geographically based plans. I found from Boston and Cambridge that actually I learned that housing segregation is the cause of school segregation, which is not a very big aha, and that's why we use zip codes as the sole way to select students. So in terms of this community's accepting us, I felt that the fact that we had such a broad range of diversity that embraced people from all over the metropolitan area in a blind zip code-based way helped us a lot to be accepted by people. At least I think so. And then in terms of the quality, well, there's nothing more important than the capacity of a teacher. The rest of us are sort of support staff. I mean, you can't do this without great teachers, and it's an uneven process at all times. It's not for everyone who's a teacher to want to work in a place like this, nor for me to want to work in another place, which is perfectly fine. But it's just something special, and that's something over time. You make mistakes, you make adjustments. I think that when we have public exhibitions of student work, which we do repeatedly, that is a way that parents and the community come in, as you saw in the film, and see, oh, this is what they're up to. It also means that if I'm a new teacher and people are looking at your work and another faculty member's work, and they're not looking at my work, I'm starting to think, hey, what's he doing and what's she doing over there? That's what I'm going to do more of the next time, because I want my students' work to be noticed too. So that's something that really doesn't exist that much in education in general, where you have these sort of mechanisms which reveal openly to the public what you're doing. That is a basis for improvement and for accountability.
Yeah, it's amazing that culture. I think what you're getting at is switching away from this hierarchical. And I've always said, teachers need to not be afraid of their bosses, and it really shouldn't even be looked at as bosses, but really administration, if you will, should be more support staff. And I love that terminology, because it is really about what those teachers can accomplish. And as they think about, reviewing, reflecting, and critiquing each other's work in a meaningful way, I think that really does professionalize and elevates that profession in a way that, our typical evaluation system has not absolutely done. So when you think about your teachers, and I'd love to get you to talk about the idea of this graduate school that you have, and sort of I'm guessing sort of cyclical nature of improvement and bringing folks in. What do you look for in teachers, and how do you keep them? Because it sounds like this is hard work. Is it harder work than being in any other school?
I couldn't say that it's harder than any other school, because I really have been a teacher for so many years that I know how hard it is to be a teacher in any school. Mm-hmm. I mean, teachers, you know where you're going to be from the first moment in September to the last moment in June.
Right.
And that's a tremendous demand on a human being's life. And I just love teachers, and I love good teachers. What we look for are people who love to teach, love being around children, have for lack of a better word, a progressive view about matters of equity and about matters of pedagogy, when they come in, those few that get invited in, a lot of people apply online, a huge amount online, and we invite them in over successive Fridays. We will have them teach some classes, and we will observe them, and students will observe them. The students who are the age level of that the teacher might teach sit in a circle like speed dating, and the candidates go around and the students interview them, and we get data from them. And in particular, we also have dilemmas, kind of like Socrates created in 400 BC, like law school, which I went to, is all about dilemmas, and schools are dilemma machines. And those are things that it's tough for a candidate to have prepared for, and it really tells where they stand in terms of matters of equity, where there's a fact pattern that they're given, and they have to write about how they would handle it. Those are the processes that we use to sort of select our teachers when they first come in. It's really, but it's kind of it's a chance that they're taking coming to us, and it's a chance that we're taking them, and we do not have tenure. And everyone is on a one-year contract in the whole organization, and most people return. The overwhelming majority have been here for some time. That's pretty much how we look at it. I just think that one person said, well, of course you're getting these results. You've got great teachers. And I said, yeah, I'll try it sometime without that. I mean, good luck.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And I'm in preparation, I'm going to do a podcast with Rick DeFore and his new book, In Praise of American Educators, and he really brings some really great points about teacher preparation and that culture as well. So I'm looking forward to that. But and so, do you pay them more? Do you what is it that you say most of them come back? And it sounds like a rigorous process to get in and to stay in. What is it that keeps them there?
Well, I think it is a happy place to work. I think it's a respectful place to work, and they work in teams. That's another thing. There's not the autonomous isolation that you see in particular schools, and some people don't stay, but also they're young and they marry and they move and things like that. Mm-hmm. In terms of compensation, we're in the state teachers retirement system. We're sort of all of us in the United States were in such a sort of a dying breed of defined benefit plans, which are a fantastic asset. And with that comes a social contract. That means that the compensation is going to be within certain norms that are comparable to the other teachers around you who are in public schools. So, no, they're not paid more nor less, really. It's pretty much comparable, I would say. Mm-hmm. Not exactly the same, but comparable. Depending on variables. So basically, that's what I think what keeps them. I hope to think what keeps them is that they feel professional satisfaction and reward from working in an institution like this, and that they feel that they're being respected.
So some of those things that we know Daniel Pink talks about, that autonomy and mastery and purpose,
precisely all those things that Daniel talks about are spot on.
Yeah. And so tell us a little bit about the graduate school idea. How does that work? Are your teachers in there, out of there? I mean, is it a farm system, the development league?
Well, it is. What happened was that I always wonder why we did a graduate school of education, but basically it was a little bit foggy because I had something to do with it. There's 1,400 of them in the United States, and Ted Sizer was a mentor of mine, a great gentleman and great educator. He had been the dean at Harvard for some time, even became it at a very early age, and then he did several other wonderful things before he passed away. And he once said that going to a graduate school of education that's not embedded in K-12 schools would be comparable to going to medical school and never seeing a body, right? So we did have a little bit of resistance to the idea that we were embedded within K-12 schools, which is rare. I mean, extraordinarily rare, as in there's less than 5 of us in the United States out of 1,400.
Unfortunately rare.
And unfortunately rare, and I've taught at other great ed schools that don't do that. So I'm not critiquing them. I'm merely saying that we need some exploration, and we need to try things differently. And that's all we really wanted to do, we did feel that if we had one, we could not merely prepare people for the pedagogy of our schools, but we had to be broader than that because, after all, it is the academy. So to it. I am teaching, since I'm also an attorney, as I mentioned, I'm teaching a school law class here, which meets tomorrow night, Tuesday night, and again on Thursday night. And those classes deal with the 14th, 4th, and First Amendment in particular, so that these 25 people who will be school leaders, that's the school leadership program, will have agency. Not that they're an attorney, but they have agency in terms of understanding how equal protection and search and seizure and free speech find themselves within schools. They happen all the time, but here's how you understand it and work with it to the benefit of your students, faculty, and school culture. So it's great fun to have them because they're energetic and wonderful. It was arduous to actually get it. And it's also been a channel for us to select a few people to lead some of our own schools as well as to help other people because they've gone out and are leading other schools around the country and world.
Yeah, I love the idea. Your professional culture of learning just seems to. I've not been able to visit to High Tech High, but I just love the idea of that professional culture there feeding itself. So maybe one of these days I'll get out to San Diego and check it out. Now, you mentioned equity above pedagogy. What is, and you've talked about the equity part, let's talk about the pedagogy. What are the sort of stalwarts or pillars of pedagogy from your perspective or High Tech High's perspective?
Well, I think that it comes from sort of, in our view, sort of a Deweyan, John Deweyan perspective, that education is not preparation for life. Education is life itself. Right. And that we want to have, our kids have published over 100 books. They've gotten patents. They also take the SAT and the ACT because we want them going to college. They are going to college in very significant numbers, especially for their demography. We have 48% of our students are free or reduced lunch. The national average is 50, right? We don't want to be a 100% free or reduced lunch school, which is not a critique of those who are doing it. That's just what we're trying to do. So we want to be a place where kids are creating new knowledge. I'm looking out at all manner through the windows of my office, all manner of projects and things that have been done already this year that have complexity and that integrate science, math, English, and history. I mean, of course, those are, as the film pointed out, an odd collection of things as a way to dice out the world. Right. We experience the world in a much more integrated way, and we try to do that too. But we still have to show a transcript that colleges aren't going to look at it and say, I don't understand what this means. I'm not taking your student. Right? So you're always walking that line between the two. It's not that difficult to do. We found a way to do it. But to go back to what I said earlier, I want this to feel like a place where kids are loving being here and loving working. I'll leave you with this particular one. We had someone who visited actually from the South, and a wonderful gentleman who's starting a new school, retired from the military. He's been here a few times with his team. And recently, he sent me an email. I was not here when he came by, and he said, sorry we missed you the other day. The young 10th grader that took us on a tour was charming and informed, as always. And we asked her if she had homework at night, and she said no. And we said, well, what do you do when you go home? She said, work on my projects. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so project-based learning is a focus there. And what's your sort of snapshot? I mean, sometimes I boil my idea of project-based learning down to a couple of things. But how would you quickly describe project-based learning? What are the big pieces that need to be there?
I think that projects are have a few key elements. Okay, reflection, documentation. And exhibition, right? So basically, you want to investigate something, and then you want to reflect on that documentation, on that investigation of that observation. You then want to document your observations and your reflections. Those those reflections can be solo and in teams. The observations can be solo and in teams. The reflections can be solo and in teams. And then you want to finally create something, which is a written document or a book or a movie or a big complex structure, like I'm looking at a very complex staircase that our students just built. That is an exhibition of that which you observed, reflected, documented, and then exhibited. That's a simple way I have found to describe what project-based learning is about. And it's group learned. It's group learned and it's group taught by multiple teachers, multiple students.
Yeah. I usually kind of try to boil it down to students making, creating, and that's kind of one of those things that you're talking about, and then teachers and students using what I call rich inquiry to get there, and there's all those things, authenticity and those kinds of things. But there's a shift there, and there's a friction point. Certainly, when we look at project-based learning, when I work with teachers in schools, the friction point between that content and content standards and testing, and is most likely to succeed points out that, and you've mentioned as well, that when you do this kind of teaching in different. From a different approach, you're still seeing those same kinds of results, but I think there's a shift. As a blog piece we have on Teach Thought, are you teaching content or are you teaching thought? And when you think about schools, most of the time they're teaching content and hoping to get that thought in, but it sounds to me like you're doing the opposite more so, and what I really love is that you're really getting after the thinking skills, and then the content comes with it in a much more deep fashion. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say, and also, once we had something called All Schools Day, where all 600 plus of our employees come, and I welcome people in August. And one year, a few years ago, someone said, "Who was a great teacher you had?" And I said, "So and so for employment discrimination," a long time ago, in the 70s, back in Boston. And I said, "Here's why. You had in the class, Black power, white power, feminist, conservative. The whole spectrum is in law school, right?" And the course was employment discrimination. And he said, "What is your position about this case you just read?" And everyone figuratively threw their fist in the air with a strong belief in their position across the political spectrum, different positions, but very strongly held from having read the case. He then changed the fact pattern and said, "What if it happened like this?" And then everybody didn't have their fist all the way up. We only had it up 3/4 of the way because we weren't so sure, because he so artfully changed the fact pattern that we weren't so sure about our belief system. And then he changed it a second time, and then our hands just up a little bit. And then he changed it a third time, and then we have our hands in our lap because we're not so sure. By the end of that class, he used pure Socratic method that was factually based, in which he kept changing the fact pattern until you were not so sure what your belief really was. And then for the next 48 hours, you'd be in a store, you'd be walking, you'd be eating, whatever, you'd be lying in bed, and you'd be thinking and thinking and thinking to get back to the homeostasis of your own belief system. That's great teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wrote him a note that night, and I said, "I'm a career educator. It's been 30 years and 33,000 miles. And I'm sure you don't remember me, but today someone asked me who was a great teacher I had, and I said, you. Thank you for teaching me a little bit about how to teach people how to think." And I went to bed, West Coast time. The next morning, I woke up. He sent me an email that simply said, "To say the least, you have really made my day." What I would say to everyone who's listening to this podcast is, everybody start asking people randomly on the street who was a great teacher they had. And invariably, you will find someone say it was someone who had deep content knowledge of their area and had passion for that area and brought us into that passion. That's great teaching. Everyone knows that's what's great teaching. And what I think everyone needs to do right now is think of a great teacher you had and write them a note and thank them.
Yeah, it is. Having had a note come to me from a student or two, it is really gratifying because you don't see it always right in front of you, especially in not so productive situations. But to get those are really, really a nice piece. That's a great piece of advice. So a couple last things here, and I want to let you go, but I'm imagining, and tell me if I'm wrong, that you, because of you have a bit of a high profile, you get an opportunity to talk with or be around or be audience with some of the folks who make education policy at a higher level. But clearly we're not making the progress in education reform or progressive education that we've admired the problem for years, and you do make a point that you're not a model. Schools should not be exactly like high tech high, because not everybody learns the same way and all of that. But why, when you are, assuming you are around these folks, why are we not making any more progress? I mean, do they not see that, or what's holding us back?
Well, I think that there are several political impediments to doing so. Now I'm trying to get myself in trouble.
Right.
We're one of the. Thanks for that. But no, where there's only a couple of countries in the world that have publicly elected school boards, and I've had many friends on school boards. But I think that is a challenge. There are other ways to do it, like having the city manager who has a sacred public trust, public safety, public housing, public health, public works, but not the public schools. We don't have lay boards in all those other areas. Why not? Right? I don't expect that to change, but I think that's an impediment. I think tenure is an impediment. I don't think collective bargaining is, but I do think that tenure is. I debated the head of the National Education Association on that issue respectfully some years ago in Washington, D.C., and said that. So I'm on the record for that, because basically there are about 10 laws that have come into existence since tenure that restrict you from arbitrarily and capriciously firing all kinds of people in protective classes. So it's not as if that could just be willy-nilly happening. I think in terms of the federal government, where some of my close friends work and have worked, and I have worked with them a lot, I think that the challenge that they have is that we still essentially have a state and locally based system, not a national system. So there's not that much that they really can affect, and that's another challenge. So that's my analysis. That and parental expectations, perhaps, and that everybody went to school. And if you actually do the midwifery, you can get them to say, well, now that you've actually drawn this out of me, I guess it would be sort of a fragmented kind of an experience. But I want the same thing for my kids. You know what I mean? So I think that those are the impediments: are parental expectations, governance issues, both at the local and at the national level, tend to be the key impediments to growth. But the world is changing, as I said earlier, and I really think that schools need to be. And we're working with a lot. Well, we have 5,000 visitors a year, self-invited, and we're working with several countries. And there are several countries that are really starting to think about this very seriously. And I would say, as both an American and also an internationalist, that if people really wanted to think about maybe they need to do things differently, they should hear what some of these other countries are talking about. And they say maybe we should get started ourselves.
Yeah, and I think your point is really a good one when we think about some of those impediments in teacher tenure, and that's a really tricky piece, and I think the point is well taken, but it's also important to note that there's it's an ecosystem. It's not just doing away with teacher tenure and then everything else stays the same. I mean, it is not something that can be done in a vacuum, and this is a real ecosystem. And so really thinking about how do we change that ecosystem to ensure better teaching and learning, I think is what we really need to get to. So one last question here. One of the things I really like to ask folks to answer and think about and give resources, and your name comes up in a lot of people's answers here, but when you think about saying, boy, this is something that I read or looked at, watched, this is a person that really made me think differently or more or profoundly, anything that you'd recommend to the listeners, something that you've come across recently or maybe not so recently?
Oh, well, I'm trying to remember the author's name right now, so that's going to be a problem. But I was in South Africa, and someone left a book. I was there with the foundation, and they left a book in my hotel room called The Art of the Idea. So find that book. It's a very, very clever book. I find that very, very refreshing. And then, of course, I'm an old school type of guy. I think that though Dewey is a little bit stiff in some of his writing, I think art as experience is in particular very apropos, because the idea of art as experience, when I think about it, I'm sorry, and the way he thought about it, but I agree with, is that when we're looking at a piece of a creation that a student does, that it's, you want to not just look at the piece itself, and this comes to accountability as well, is we'll look through the piece and look at who created it, how they created it, and what they were thinking. What was the experience behind the art? And then ourselves and other people who are looking at it and the student work. What is our experience looking at this piece, looking at what this student created? So those are a couple of them. Of course, anything of Ted Sizer's is significant to me. Anything of Debbie Myers is significant to me. I love The Having of Wonderful Ideas is another great book. Those are some of the favorite books that I live by.
Yeah, I looked at The Art of the Idea, I think is John Hunt. Looks like one from
very good. That was him, and thank you. Yeah, a lovely book. It's the kind of, I wish I wrote it. and if people look at it, just look at the index before you even look at the rest of the book. The index itself. I've given that book. Your listeners should know that I've given away 30 copies, and everyone who's ever gotten one said that was wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, that's great. So if folks, I don't know if they can come to High Tech High, and I know you do sort of tours is probably not the right word, but how should they do that? What's that look like? They can go to the website, which is hightechhigh.org, and
you will see visitors and all that stuff, and go visit. We love having people visit. We learn from them just as they learn from us. And finally, I must add Young Zhao's book before we get off. My dear friend Young Zhao. And I love how adorable and honest he is, because he gets away with murder with that honesty, because he's such a precious human being with that smile and happy-go-lucky, not happy-go-lucky, but that warm smile. And I love the fact that I've been going with him several years in a row now to work in Beijing. It's an honor to work with that man.
Yeah, we just did a podcast with him recently. Is it Counting What Counts? I know he's got several books. Is that the book you're referring to?
Yeah, the new one about the big red dragon.
Oh, okay.
Is new. It's really quite good, and he demolishes PISA scores, which I'm forever grateful for him doing.
Yeah, it is interesting to that we still use these scores and achievements and all these things as the ultimate goal, when really what we're after is something much bigger and much different.
Well, on that note, I'd like to share with everybody the fact that I have a big banner in huge letters outside my office. Anyone can find this sentence by going to Google and looking up Campbell's Law. Don Campbell was a sociology professor in the 70s at University of Michigan. There's an entire Wikipedia entrance for just one sentence that I'm now going to tell you. The more any quantitative social indicator or even some qualitative indicator is used for social decision-making, the more subject it will be to corruption pressures, and the more apt it will be to distort and corrupt the social processes it is intended to monitor.
Well, that's a mouthful, but it's absolutely, wow. Yeah, that's profound.
Okay, so if that was much for your listeners, just go to Campbell's Law, read it slowly. It is an extremely astute and accurate statement, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, and we'll put that in the show notes and the links. So, Larry, it's been a real pleasure to talk with you. I'm a big admirer of your work. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much. Great talking with you.
That'll do it for today. Thanks for listening. If you didn't hate it, please give us a quick review on iTunes. We record weekly and sometimes multiple episodes per week. Questions? Email us at podcast@teachthought.com or find us on the Teach Thought Twitter account @TeachThought.